there is a mute button. If you want to mute yourself, please do that. We'd love to see you, though, on video. If you can turn your video on, we would love to see you. We're excited to have you all here. There is a chat box down at the bottom as well that you can click on that little speech bubble. You can see different links that we might post in the chat. Or
Hello?
if you have questions, you can get in the chat as well. Welcome, Beatrice. We are able to hear you. We're not able to see you, but we can hear you.
Can you see me? Okay, I'm wondering how to, I haven't used Zoom on my phone for a while, but all of a sudden I can't open my browser. I'm having a big problem with my computer. So how do can you tell me how to turn on my,
if you
there it goes. There it goes. There it goes.
Yeah, there you go. I was
Yes,
going to say swipe to the left. There you go. Now we can.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I'm late. I'm having I've never had this kind of a problem with my computer. I cannot even open a browser. It's telling me I have to call Apple support to open the browser. So then I had to use my phone, and then my phone was making me update Zoom. And so finally I'm here.
No problem, hon. So we're just getting everybody in, and if you would, as you come in, if you'll hit your mute button, I'm going to let Erica go ahead and tell a couple of announcements, and then we'll turn it over to Claire. So Erica?
Yeah, welcome everybody to the July Great Lakes Region Midday Cafe. It's great to be back with you. And so we just want to remind you how you can stay connected. And so we want to invite you just from the very top to be a part of the International Enneagram Association. And so I'm going to post the link here in just a bit for you if you're interested in being a member. The Great Lakes region is really excited always to offer this free call, but we have other things that we love doing. And so when you join the IEA, we'd love for you to affiliate with the Great Lakes region. It helps us to be able to give you gifts like this and awesome teachers like Beatrice Chestnut, who are going to be with us today, and just continue this great work. And so I want to let you know about a couple of opportunities that are coming up in the Great Lakes region. And so if you are a last minute person, you love to travel, and you are looking for an Enneagram great vacation, this week, the IEA Global Conference is in Oakland, California. And so it's going to be the 25th year of celebration. They've got some great things going on, just foundations for the future. And we'll also be celebrating and honoring the life of Claudio Naranjo, one of the master teachers that recently passed away. And so it's going to be an awesome time. Several of us from the GLR are going as board representatives, and we're excited about that. There's some neat conferences coming up as well, training certifications. And so one in September on the Enneagram and Prayer in historic Marshall, Michigan with Scott and Clare Loughrige. So I'll post the link for that. And then also a couple of opportunities to connect with Dr. Jerry Wagner, one right before that's starting in just a few days, the San Francisco training for him that he's doing with Catherine Grant, and then an opportunity in Chicago as well this fall. So check out those certifications. And then for the very first time in Motions of the Soul history, Claire and Scott Loughrige are going to be offering a fall Motions of the Soul certification. So that's happening in October 21st through the 24th. It's a beautiful time to travel to Michigan, but great way to just increase your knowledge of the Enneagram and also move you forward as a practitioner, being certified with the Enneagram Motions of the Soul. So I'll drop links in the chat for all of those, but I'm going to turn it over to Claire to go ahead and get started with our guest today.
Thanks, Erica. And I am loving seeing all of these people that we know and love. Some folks that we were just together in June. Glad you guys are a part of this. This is your first time on, just raise your hand if it's your first time on Midday Cafe. Excellent. We are so glad you're here. And I think several of you were here in Marshall, Michigan for my training in June, where we referenced B's 27 subtypes and let you know if you want the big book on subtypes, you've got to buy the complete Enneagram. And then we also show the book that this 3 loves, which is the little book, the little 40-page book that I can keep at my chair side. So when I'm sitting with people in spiritual direction or consultation, That's a really helpful guide as well. So we are so blessed today to be hosting Beatrice Chestnut, one of the most authoritative voices on subtypes. And so when we think about the work that Bea has done with leaders, and now even in her academy, which she might tell us a little bit about that today as well. She's a licensed psychotherapist, a coach, a business consultant, and a PhD in communications and an MA in clinical psychology. She's been studying the Enneagram for 27 years. And so I really, when I think about Beatrice, and I've learned from her at conferences and in the seminar at Loyola University, I want to say that I love her head, and I love her heart, and I love her instincts. And she gives us a lens into the Enneagram that is kind, and yet will challenge you. So get ready for that. One of the things that I thought we could do as we began, though, is Beatrice, her teacher, Claudio Naranjo, passed away this past week. And I said I'd really like to begin this Midday Cafe with a moment of gratitude in silence for all he's given to Beatrice and the Enneagram world, but specifically to Beatrice today as our teacher. So we want to just bow our heads or close our eyes, or whatever way you can practice gratitude for the gift of Claudio Naranjo. And from that place of gratitude, I read an article that Beatrice wrote about when she discovered her own subtype, and it was with Claudio Naranjo. And I thought it would be a wonderful way to begin for you to tell us that story. Bea, if you would, we want to say welcome and thank you for being with us. And we want to receive you from a place of story today. So please tell us.
Thank you, Claire. That was a beautiful introduction. So I learned the Enneagram in 1990 from David Daniels, who probably many of you know. I was a friend of his son, so I learned it over the dinner table one night, quite informally. But I went and read about my type. David just said, I think you might be a 2. And I went and read my type, and I was completely hooked from day one. And so I was lucky enough to live in Palo Alto, kind of ground zero for the Enneagram, especially in those days. And so I went through the narrative tradition training in the mid-90s. And the Enneagram was instrumental in my own work in understanding myself and getting into therapy for the first time, and then observing myself as part of my therapeutic process. But I never really understood the subtypes in the first 14 years of my Enneagram education. And it wasn't until 2004 when Claudio Naranjo came to the IEA conference and did 3 mornings on the subtypes. He brought about 15 or 16 of his colleagues from all over the world. And as some of you may know, Claudio, he brought the Enneagram. I think he is the person most responsible for the Enneagram that most of us work with today. Certainly, one of the things I liked about him is he always cited his sources, and I think it's really important to do that in our Enneagram work. And he always credited Oscar Ichazo for the original model, but Naranjo learned that model from Ichazo, which was part of a much bigger system of personal development that Oscar Ichazo was teaching in his Eureka school. And Claudio really translated what he learned from Ichazo. He elaborated on the types through his observations and intuition. And remember, he was a psychiatrist. He was also a leader in the human potential movement. and had worked with Fritz Perls. A lot of the therapeutic process he did was Gestalt therapy. He did a lot of drama therapy. And he also knew about the Gurdjieff work, which is another source of what we know about the Enneagram symbol. He had a vast knowledge of meditation and spirituality, and all these things. And so in some ways, he was the perfect person to receive this knowledge from Ichazo and bring it forward in a way. And he did it through a group he was working with in Berkeley in the 70s and 80s. And it leaked out from his original group. But it was one of many things that he was working with in that group. They worked with meditation and Gestalt. But I think it was through actually working with people and talking to people and that he really was able to clarify the 9 types as we know them today. So I always think of the Enneagram that we work with today as the Naranjo Enneagram, because I think it's different than the Ichazo Enneagram. I've studied a little bit in the Eureka School, and they describe some of the types a little bit differently. But Naranjo was a bit estranged from the American Enneagram community for many years. And this is an important piece to know in the subtype story. He was turned off by a few different things that happened, partly the way the Enneagram leaked out from one of his early groups. And so he did most of his teaching in South America and Mexico and Europe. And so he wasn't really, there's a way that the American Enneagram community, I think, grew up a little bit separately from him, even though he was really the source of the original knowledge. And so when he came in 2004 to do the subtype training, it was really, I mean, I credit the leaders of the IEA at the time. I was on the board, but I was new on the board, for bringing him back. Because I think it was really important that they invited him in again to share his incredible wisdom, and in a way that I think many people who may have grown up in the Enneagram without access to him maybe didn't understand where everything really originated with him. So he brought and I can't see you, Claire, anymore. I don't know if that's a problem, but I can only see a little phone. So I don't know if the technologist, now I can see you.
Now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now I can see you.
Yeah. Anytime I speak, you'll see me.
Okay.
Okay. So I'll make sure I'm saying yes.
Good. Yeah. Okay. Now I can see you ongoing. Okay. So in 2004, he came with his teachers to teach, 350 plus people at this Enneagram conference, the subtypes. And so it was a very interesting encounter, because he hadn't really been engaged with the Enneagram community for a while, but we had invited him in. Now, so I think what that means for the subtypes is, the subtypes I learned when I was coming up through my first 14 years of Enneagram study, I never really found it that valuable, to tell you the truth. It just seemed like there wasn't a lot of information there. I didn't really know how to determine my subtype. I didn't really know what to do with it. It seemed like there just wasn't that much information. There were many different teachers that would said different things and called the subtypes different. So for me, it was very confusing and not helpful. And I even was sort of bothered when they would bring the topic up, because it just seemed like, why are you talking about this? There's no there. This isn't really adding anything. I don't really get it. And so I would even sometimes leave the room when they would talk about subtypes, because I just couldn't really engage. It was really hard for me to know how to enter into that part of the teaching. But when Naranjo came in 2004 and taught the first day of subtypes, everything changed for me. And then the first day he went through all 27. And I was stunned, because what he was saying was completely different than I had heard before. I mean, there were some overlaps, but the overlaps were fairly minor, because he was adding in so much more information. And I was really surprised that he had developed so much that we didn't know about, those of us who hadn't really studied more closely with him. So what happened is, on the second day, they had everyone go into groups and by type. And then his army of teachers would come around and help people figure out what subtype they thought that they were. according to Claudio's more elaborated definitions. So they came up to me, and I had sort of thought I was asexual too, but what I found after really learning Claudio's approach is that I think a lot of heart types mistype themselves as sexual dominance when really they're just heart types. I find that happens a lot with fours. A lot of fours think they're sexual fours, and when they find out, again, through Claudio's approach, what the description of the sexual four is, they don't usually relate to the subtype description. But in any case, I sort of thought I was a sexual too, but I really didn't know. I was pretty clear I was confused, and I wasn't really even sure what the entry point was to figuring out what type you were. So they came up to me, one of Claudio's teachers, and he said, "We think you're a self-preservation too." They had written self-preservation too on the piece of paper. And I noticed my defenses coming up, because the day before I had heard
Ding,
Claudio.
ding, ding, ding.
Yes, exactly. Like I could almost, to this day, I can almost like see the little wall come up, of the wall, the cloud of unknowing, the unconscious resistance. But I had remembered the day before when Claudio said that the self-preservation too is childlike. And I remember so clearly. It's amazing that there's so much I don't remember, but it's amazing that this was so clear to me. I remember when he said that the self-preservation too is childlike. It's almost like I can still see the little bubble above my head, the little cartoon bubble that says, "Oh, that's not me. I'm not childlike." Right? Cross that one off the list, So when this guy said I was self-preservation too, I was like, wow, wait a minute, that's not me. I'm not childlike. But luckily, I'd been in the Enneagram. I'd been working on myself for 14 years. I'd been in therapy for a while. So I knew enough to sort of say, okay, ego, like put down the defenses and just listen and open up and at least take in the information, and maybe there's something you can learn here. So I think that's a good idea whenever you're working with the subtypes, because they do shed light on a more unconscious part of ourselves, the more reptilian brain that a lot of times we don't want to look at. And of course with twos, in some ways twos have the hardest time looking at sort of the dark side because of pride, and I think one of the things I really like about Claudio's teaching generally is the way he talks about twos. I'll try not to get on too big of a tangent here, but I just think in the US Enneagram community, we really don't describe twos well. We describe them very simplistically as helpers and givers who like meeting needs. And that did not describe me at all. And so one of the things I love about Naranjo is he complicates the two description. It's like, it's strategic help, by the way, and that's the important thing. So anyway, I digress. When I asked him about that, I said, well, what do you mean? Like, why do you think I'm a self-preservation too? And it was amazing what he did. Instead of like getting into a long lecture or anything, he just stood next to me. I think he was from Italy, so he had a beautiful accent. And he stood next to me and he said, when I stand next to you like this, I do not think you're going to protect me. I think I need to protect you. And it just like the recognition went through me. And even today, I can still get emotional even thinking about that moment of recognition. When you like feel the truth in your body and your head wants to argue with it and say, no, that's not right. I'm not like that. But I couldn't argue. It was like, wow, like that is something I'd never thought of before. I had no idea that on some level, the self-preservation too is about needing protection. And again, in a way that most self-preservation twos are not conscious of. And certainly I wasn't. At that moment, that time, I was probably in my early, late 30s, early 40s. And I felt very independent, like many twos do. I don't need any help. That's the two thing. That's pride, right? And so it was a huge awakening for me, almost the same as when I found out I was a two, to learn I was a self-preservation two and what that meant in the Naranjo definition. And I learned I was much more afraid than I thought I was. I was more mistrustful than I was acknowledging. And in fact, I realized they asked me about fear and trust. And I thought to myself, wow, I don't trust anybody. Like, of course, if you'd asked me a few years before, I would have said I trusted people, but I realized that's because I wanted the image of somebody who was good in relationship and who was open and trusting, which comes from pride, right? And so what I realized is the truth is I was quite fearful, you know, and in some ways still am, in relationship. And there's a lot of ambivalence for the self-preservation too. We want to move forward. We want to connect with you, but we're also afraid of that. What will you ask of me? Will I need to meet your needs in a way that I really don't want to, but won't be able to say no to? Will I be rejected? You know, and the whole thing about being childlike is just an incredible, interesting, psychological situation that I had no idea of. And I still find like a lot of self-pres twos have a hard time recognizing this in themselves when I travel around teaching the subtypes. It's probably one of the hardest ones to own. Because if you look at your life, you know, well, you know, I'm doing pretty well. I'm functional. I don't need anyone to take care of me. And so it's counter pride. It can be hard to see through the pride because self-pres twos also make themselves small. And so, and can feel insecure like many twos can. So it can feel sort of, it's hard to relate to how do I make myself bigger from the point of view of a self-pres two.
Yeah. And I wonder if that experience of the one you don't want to be, just like when we discover our Enneagram type, everybody, right? Like put your thumb up if that happened to you when you found out and then you wanted to buy a vowel, you wanted to buy a number, anything else other than what was being named.
Right.
But with the instincts, I had a different experience. When I learned the instincts from Jerry Wagner, I didn't have a big aha moment. When I learned from Mario, I was ticked off that he said I was a sexual 3. And it had something to do with the fact that I had a purple dress on at the conference, which just, irritated me to no end. And
understandably.
Then when he taught on transmitting types when he was at Loyola, I got that. I did get that. I did get the transmitting idea. It helped me get it a little more, but I still felt offended. But when I read your description about 1-to-1 threes being concerned about other people, like taking care of the whole, it was like finally I felt a relief that being a sexual 3 was not about me wearing a purple dress trying to transmit myself. So so can you say what you've discovered? Do you find that people have more relief or more dissonance, or is it just a mixed bag?
I usually find that when they really find their subtype, it's like I described for myself. It's a new stage of awakening. It's like a window into more clarity about type. The subtypes are so important. I mean, one of the main reasons is because some of the subtypes are not described by the main types, right? So a lot of self-preservation 4s never find themselves in the system when they just read about the 9 types, because you don't find the self-preservation 4 described by just the 9 types alone. Social 7s are not described in most versions of the 9 types, social 9s. And so there is a nuance that the subtypes bring. And when I say subtypes, I'm always going to be meaning Claudio Naranjo's approach to the subtypes, because there are big differences between this approach and other approaches. And I have enormous respect for a lot of the other teachers. But one of the things that's been really hard for me is that I haven't found an openness. I found a lot of openness around Enneagram students and enthusiasts, the people you talk to at conferences, but more people who've been teaching it for a while and teaching it their own way. Oftentimes there isn't an openness to hearing sort of this different approach. Now, on the one hand, I don't blame them. When you've been doing your thing, it's hard to not want to do your thing. But I've just found the whole reason I wrote my book, the whole reason I've become, I never set out to become like someone who taught the Enneagram subtypes, but I had such a profound experience at that conference in 2004 And it changed everything for me, and it added so much to my growth, to my, I mean, the Enneagram, let's face it, the main thing it does for us is it gives us information with which to structure our growth path, with which to make sense of how to understand ourselves and how to self-observe ourselves. And it gave me so much more information, so much more important information, so much more specific information, that it was a huge revolution in my own development. And I love the people I meet at conferences and workshops. And that's one of the best things about working with the Enneagram, is everywhere you go, you meet the most amazing people. And I wanted all those people to have benefit of learning something that really helped me a great deal. Yeah. And I noticed that after that conference in 2004, nobody did anything differently in the US. You know, they just went back. It was almost like it had never happened. And that shocked me.
And so, I wonder, if you could even do like a 40,000 foot view of the subtypes going around all 9. We're getting some things in the chat bar that people, they are saying, yes, they purchased the big book and they have the little book, and that's great. Others, I know this is a very fresh territory. Even the way I teach it in my training program, I show them, this is how robust the system is when you look at it through instincts, but I don't teach on the instincts. I recommend they read your stuff. So could you do the 40,000 foot view and let everybody know in some way why they don't always say, oh yeah, that describes me perfectly, when they read kind of the trade book stuff on here's what types are.
Sure. Yes. And first of all, just a clarification of terms. I think sometimes there's a little bit of confusion in the Enneagram community around instincts versus subtypes. And this is because when Russ and Dawn wrote The Wisdom of the Enneagram, they called the wing subtypes, and they called what I call subtypes instinctual variants. And so a lot of times people refer to the instinctual variants as the instincts for short. So I just want to clarify, when I talk about instincts, I'm talking about the 3 instincts for self-preservation, social relationship, and one-to-one or sexual bonding, the sexual subtype. And so I'll refer to instincts as those 3, and the subtypes as the 27 types that you get when you mix the passion and the pattern of the type with the dominant instinct. So just so I'm being clear.
So and everybody just breathe. Everyone breathe right now. It's okay.
You're very good, Claire. Yeah, this is a lot of information, I know, in a short amount of time. So the 40,000 foot view. So I would say, starting with ones, I'll try to keep each thing brief, but the main thing that happened for me after I started teaching this approach is I had a lot of ones coming up to me saying, thank you for what you're teaching, because I'm not a perfectionist, but I'm a 1. And sometimes it's called the perfectionist often, but really there's only one of the 3 that's a true perfectionist, one of the 3 subtypes, and that's the self-preservation one. The social one is more perfect, like they try to figure out the right way and then they model it for others. And so they're less anxious than self-preservation ones, who are more like worried about every little thing going right. And then the one-to-one or the sexual subtype is perfecting other people, right? So you have a perfectionist, perfect, and perfecting others. So there's 3 really different angles. The self-preservation one is much more critical of themselves than they are of other people. And the sexual one is much more critical of other people than they are of themselves, although they're still critical of themselves often. So again, 3 really different characters. The social one can look like a 5. And here's another thing that it's important to know. One of the problems I see when people teach the instincts is they teach them without the subtypes. And if you just teach the instincts, people get the wrong idea that when they try to figure out their subtype, they should figure out whether they like to be in groups or not, whether they make intense eye contact with people, or whether they bring a lot of things on a trip. I hear that all the time, and it's just more complicated than that, right? So once you combine one of these dominant instincts with a particular type, you get a whole different thing. It's almost like an alchemy instead of an addition. And so, for instance, social ones are, I think, the prototype of why you shouldn't think that if you're social subtype, you quote unquote feel comfortable in groups all the time, because social ones are sort of outside of the group. And that's what happens when you take the position, unconsciously, of course, as the role model or the teacher for others of how they should do things more perfectly. So that's, an example of that. So looking at twos, I would say, and I'll be a little bit, sometimes I need to modify my language, but I'll be, this is a seasoned group of Enneagram people, so I can just speak plainly. So it's 3 different ways of seducing, right? So either the self-preservation seduces, and this is Naranjo's phrase, like a child in the presence of grown-ups, charming, cute, fun-loving, playful, youthful in good ways and bad ways, fun-loving and charming, but also irresponsible at times and craving freedom. The social 2 is totally different. It's seduces, the social 2 needs to seduce the whole group, right? So you have to be a more adult person. Social 2s tend to be more leaders. They tend to be more powerful people, people who gravitate toward positions of leadership and being in charge. They give to get more. They're very strategic in their giving, and they can, on the high side, be very warm and magnanimous and take care of a lot of people and do big things and be just really powerful presences in organizations and families. On the downside, and they have a big dark side, which is control. Social 2s can want to be in control of everything, and I know when I meet a conscious social 2, when they totally own how controlling they are, and it's actually always moves me to tears, because it's not easy for social 2s to own that, and how they can be manipulative. Now, all 2s can be manipulative. I certainly can be manipulative, and it's something I've had to really learn to observe in myself. But social 2s can do that in a way they don't notice that they're doing it. And then the sexual 2 is more the classical seduction, like the femme fatale, the greatest best friend or lover that you ever had, a lot of more wild and emotional and good at flirting and good at making that one-to-one bond through being generous and outgoing and very loving, but then really wants a lot from that relationship and can suffer greatly when it ends. The 3s, I was blown away when I heard the 3s, because really the only 3 that we read about in most Enneagram books that deal just with the 9 types is the social 3. Both the self-preservation 3 and the sexual 3 are not described in descriptions. So that's why a lot of 3s mistype themselves as other types, because if you're a self-preservation or a sexual 3, it might be hard to find yourself in the 3 description, because both of those 3s are not as hungry for recognition, like on a big stage. They tend to be different. The self-preservation 3 has vanity for having no vanity. The self-preservation 3 wants to be seen as good. And if you're good, you're not vain, right? So they want an image of not only someone who's competent, productive, and successful, but also someone who's a good person, who's the good model of whatever it is they do. Now, they can look like 1s, but they're different than 1s, because 1s kind of will tell you they have an internal standard for what good is, where 3s kind of look on the outside. So self-preservation 3s, they're the hardest working, the biggest workaholics, hard for them to slow down, because you have the you have 3 kind of turbocharged by the self-preservation concern with material security. So they can be really focused on like creating enough, resources for their family, even when they're doing fine. But they have vanity for having no vanity, which means they want to look good to others, just like all 3s do, but they don't want you to know they want to look good. So it's like they don't want to brag. They're very sensitive about being too flashy or showy with their nice car, their clothes. They tend to want to downplay things. The social three is the three most of us know about: more competitive, more aggressive, more embracing of vanity, likes to be on stage and get the applause, more of the company mentality in terms of selling and marketing and being very good at that. And then the sexual three is someone who is more oriented toward relationship. It's a three that looks a little more two-ish. Sorry for that, the ringing. It's a three that looks more two-ish in that they're very focused on attracting a partner, attracting people, and wanting to be attractive. And I like the name changed from masculinity, femininity to charisma. And I really like that name for sexual threes because it's attractiveness more than just physical. It's when I meet a sexual three, it's like there's this just charisma coming out of them. It's charm. It's that intangible something that's appealing, that's more than just physical, but includes the physical. And so they tend to focus a lot on almost like being, being the model of attractiveness, so they can attract a partner and other people too. And then they're really good cheerleaders for other people. They really dedicate themselves to they have a family mentality, as Claudio says, but they also excel at cheerleading and promoting others. So it's like they're a little more shy about being on stage themselves, although they can in some circumstances, but they tend to really focus on achieving success through the people they support. And they can be just so powerful in being sort of the wind beneath other people's wings. In a way that's really beautiful, but they also are sometimes not very connected to themselves at a deeper level, as some threes can be, especially sexual three. So the fours, so with the fours, you have the self-preservation four that's long suffering, the social four that suffers more openly, and the sexual four that makes other people suffer, right? And so these are just three different ways of being with suffering. And again, all of these are defensive modes. They're all psychological defensive systems. The self-preservation four doesn't often look like a four. They don't look sad. They can look actually quite cheery and happy. I sometimes call it the sunny four. But it's a four that is, the suffering is more inside and they don't share it. And again, they often learned in childhood that people didn't want to hear about their suffering, and so they can't connect to people. And again, part of our self-preservation comes through making connections with important other people, especially early on, especially the mother, for instance. And so there's a way that the self-preservation four learns, like, okay, I've got to keep my suffering inside, and they can be more masochistic than melodramatic, right? So the social four is more in their suffering, more obviously sensitive, talks about it with people, has not only a focus on suffering, but also inferiority. All fours compare themselves, but social fours really compare themselves and wind up on the bottom of the ladder. And then sexual fours, they externalize suffering, right? So instead of, it's almost as if there's a refusal to suffer. Like, I'm not going to feel bad about myself. It's your fault that I'm not feeling good about myself. It's the world's fault for not recognizing me. So they tend to be more competitive. It's envy, and its manifestation is competition. And they tend to be more angry. So Claudio said that the sexual four is the angriest type on the Enneagram, of all 27, more angry than eights. And again, part of this is because when they feel hurt or deficient or a sense of lack inside, the response is anger. And so, of course, the growth path is to learn to get through the anger to the sadness or the pain underneath. And so again, it's like the self-preservation four takes the suffering inside, the sexual four puts it on the outside. The fives, so the fives look similar from the outside, but the self-preservation five has more avarice for boundaries, privacy. They like to get into a safe place of refuge. They want to be able to retreat there and then have everything they need in that behind walls that they don't need to come out from if they don't want to. The social five has an avarice for knowledge, and looks for meaning in life through, getting involved in social causes or becoming an expert in a field, and then having relationships to other experts. And they may be more connected to the people. It's called totem, and the totem is here are the big ideas or super values that I stand for, that I pursue as a way of finding meaning in life. But they can be more connected to the totem or to those ideals and ideas than they can to people in everyday life. They can be actually cold to people in everyday life. Also, importantly, everywhere I go now, I talk about spiritual bypassing because it's a big danger. People go to spiritual work and they don't do their psychological work, and that causes problems.
Yes,
Social,
yes,
yes.
the church is full of that, by the way.
Yes, I was presenting to a group of people who were more faith-based community recently, and that came up, and everyone was really surprised, and it came up around forgiveness. Like, shouldn't we forgive? Well, yes, but not too soon.
That's
Because
right.
if you forgive too quickly, that's a spiritual bypass. You're not really getting into the feelings that you might need to have about what happened. And that's part of the psychological work. So social fives are the prototype for the spiritual bypasser, of like saying, getting really interested in a spiritual system, but not living it out in their life, in everyday life. Sexual five has avarice for like the ideal in relationship. They tend to be a little more emotional, but you probably won't see it on the outside. It's like they have a romantic streak inside. They relate usually more to four, and they tend to sort of channel those feelings into some sort of artistic medium. It's as if they're still fives and they don't necessarily feel comfortable expressing it directly, but they do feel that, and they do want an outlet. But they look for an ideal, like the ideal relationship, and it becomes kind of a quest, and they have more of a need for intimacy than the other two fives. With sixes and fours are the most different from each other. And so I almost can't even talk about 1-6 when I teach an introductory course. You have the self-preservation 6 that copes with fear. It's the flight 6 that by hiding or bunching together with like-minded others, they look for protectors. So they're warm and friendly to attract people that will protect them. They're more doubting and questioning, and they see the world in terms of gray. Whereas the social 6 looks more like a 1 and actually copes with fear by finding a good authority. And that can be an impersonal authority, like an ideology. But there's someone who looks for guidelines and rules and knowledge and learning as a way to figure out what to do, so they're not afraid. They like to see things more in black and white. And you've disappeared again. There you are. So they like to see things more in terms of black and white. So then the sexual 6 is the fight 6. It's the counterphobic 6 that we all know about. Now, we haven't talked about counter types, but for all the 9 types, there is a counter type. And that's a big difference between this approach and everyone else. No one else talks about counter types, but I find it's really important to talk about counter types, because a lot of people who mistype themselves end up being a counter type, because it's a type that doesn't look like the main type. But all of us know sexual 6 is the most famous counter type, the counterphobic 6, the 6 that goes against fear with strength. They look more like 8s, and they don't look afraid. And the growth path for the sexual 6 is actually getting in touch with their fear and vulnerability more. So then 7, self-preservation 7 is a more practical 7, a more self-interested 7, someone who really pursues pleasure, and also finds what they need through a network of people that they cultivate. Claudio says, like a good mafia. So they tend to be very practical, which is in total opposition to the sexual 7 that is more of a dreamer or an idealist. They sort of have their head in the clouds. And then the social 7 is a 7 that goes against gluttony. It's the counter type, and decides to be of service to others. So social 7s want to be seen as being good. And so they tend to fear, or they feel bad if anyone ever accuses them of being selfish or self-interested. They want to go against that element that is part of the 7 personality of being self-referencing. And then the 8s, you have the self-preservation 8 that can look a little bit like a 5, more self-contained, more focused on material security and getting needs met in a very direct way without talking about it much. The social 8, which is the counter type, which can look like a 2, actually, especially in women. And there are 2s that are very much into protecting other people, mentoring, taking care of. Archetypally, Claudio says it's the 8 that became violent in protecting the mother from the father. So that's archetypally, it's like they protect those who can't protect themselves from the patriarchy or the power, or someone that might exploit them. So it's so funny. I meet so many social 8s, for instance, who are involved in dog rescue. It's incredible. I just was doing a coaching call with a new client the other day, and she turned out to be a social 8. And I mentioned that. She said, "Oh my God, that's what I do. That's what she does, in her part-time, in her off time." And then the sexual 8 is an 8 that's more about power and possessing the whole scene, possessing the environment, being the one who everyone's looking at. They're very magnetic. They're very passionate and action oriented, but not as much thinking in the picture. And they just like to be the one who has everyone's attention. And then 9s, last but not least, there are 3 different ways of not paying attention to yourself, but paying attention to something other than yourself as a way of distracting yourself from your own sense of being. So 9s tend not to be in touch with their own being, and sort of the sloth is about doing a lot of other things for other people, but not really being tuned into themselves at a deep level. And so the 3 subtypes are 3 different things they pay attention to instead of themselves. And the self-preservation pays attention to comfort and routine and physical activities that help them ground. They like being more alone than the other 2. They can be a little bit more irritable and sort of hard to move than the other 2. The social 9 is a 9 that merges with groups, and so works really hard on behalf of groups. They're the biggest workaholic. They get mistyped as 3s all the time, but they differ from 3s because they don't really need the recognition. They're doing it for belonging. Social 9s sometimes feel like a sense of sadness that they don't belong, and so they work really hard to earn membership. But of course, these are ego processes, and we never really get what we're looking for on the level of personality. So they can work really, really, really hard, and without letting people see them sweat, and not ever feel like they're really in the picture. And then sexual 9s are 9s that merge with others, particular others, important people in their life. And sexual 9s merge very deeply, and sometimes they have a sense of no boundaries between them and the other person. It can be hard to know and find their own sense of purpose. They can take on the attitudes and feelings of that other person and not really know they've done it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, wow, 40,000 foot view, but does anybody just want to wave and say, yeah, that went cha-ching. One of the things that I want to know that maybe you can't answer on this particular Midday Cafe, but I'd love to know about the psychological bypass for each of the types, because as a pastor, I see people with the false bifurcation of I'm going to develop spiritually, but I'm not going to do the psychological work. And so I was listening through that lens, like where would the psychological bypass be in each of those, where it is less about doing my whole person work. And, and so we can't talk about that today, but I do want to, we have one of the questions we have that I know you can answer quickly is, are people one instinct or a mixture? And so if you could just give them that lovely picture the way you do of how that works.
Sure. And when I say we, I mean me and my teaching partner, Uranio Pius. We believe, and he, by the way, is brilliant at teaching about the instincts versus the subtypes. He's studied a lot in Gurdjieff schools and the Sufi tradition. So the question was, again, I got lost. I know. It's so we call it an instinct sequence. It's been called stack, but I never really liked the word stack with reference to instincts, because that gives me the image of something fixed, like a stack of books. And these are biological they're energies, they're drives, and so we call it a sequence. And there's a dominant instinct, and that's the one that determines your subtype. But then there's one in the second place, and then there's one that's repressed. Now, some people call that third instinct the blind spot. We don't call it the blind spot because it's more than a blind spot. It's being pushed out of consciousness. And again, these are biological drives. This is the animal part of us, the reptilian brain. And so you've got to kind of push it out of the way to make it so you're not aware of it. And it's usually a sphere of life we gave up on. as opposed to something that we're overdoing. So the dominant instinct, it's like it takes up too much space in our consciousness, more than it actually should. You know, Claudio said in health, the instincts just operate as needed, but they're not like always operating or overperforming. Like when you're hungry, you eat, you know, but people who are self-pres like me, it's like they're always thinking about their next meal, like they're going to starve, you know, like I'm probably not going to starve. And yet it's like self-preservation dominance can almost feel like their life is always under threat. You know, the sexual dominant can feel like that other person is everything. You know, the social dominant can feel like, you know, they'll sacrifice individuals for the social cause. You know, there's a way that there's something that's being overdone. But in the repressed instinct, we find it's really important to identify that too, because there's so much that comes out of that. Like, for instance, people who have self-preservation as the repressed instinct can actually put their lives in danger. They have suicidal tendencies in some cases. They don't care for themselves. It's like they've given up on valuing their life in a certain way. People who are social repressed sometimes feel really threatened in crowds or in groups. They feel skeptical of any kind of social movements. They actively avoid being a part of anything because sometimes there's an underlying fear or even a generational background of torture or genocide. I mean, and we talk about sort of the collective shadow of the instincts. We talk about the psychological dimension of the instincts, like, for instance, and some people want to disembody the instincts from the psychological. The instinct is part of our person. It's one layer, one interconnected layer of our personality. So for instance, the psychological dimension goes a little bit like this. People who are self-preservation dominant usually have a specific wound connected to the mother. People who are social dominant usually have a specific issue connected to the father. And people who are sexual dominant usually have a very particular background where they got caught between mother-father and the mother-father-child triangle. And oftentimes they were the Oedipus complex, they were the Oedipal winner. So it's the little girl who is daddy's little girl, or the little boy who's very close to mom. You know, sometimes there was a divorce and that actually the child got put in the place of the partner. They were closer to their parent than the spouse was, or the former spouse. So we find that that's a really interesting thing, you know, there's that other dimension. So we think it's a sequence, and it's important to know what the whole sequence is and to work on it that way.
Yeah, I love that. I love the word sequence because it's all there. And then in particular times of life, midlife, you know, self-pres might feel like it's right on top because we're just trying to make sure we can get to the other end.
Right, exactly. Yes. In certain moments, the other one may come up more strongly than usual. Now, I don't think it changes the default setting completely. However, the whole work with instincts is trying to put them more in balance.
Beautiful. Chris asked a question about and this is just quick, obviously, in our last few minutes, but why are some of the teachers resistant to embracing subtypes?
Well, I think with some of the teachers, they just do it their own way, right? So there was one person who told me when my subtype booklet came out, so I'm not going to read it because I'm doing my own thing, right? And so I think when you have, you know, time and money invested in what you've been teaching, it's hard to open up to something new because, I mean, again, this is just me. You'd have to ask them, you know, why, but, you know, my hypothesis is that you know, their ego. I'm just going to be honest. There's ego reasons. There's you know, there's checkbook reasons not to sort of open up. Now, the thing to know about me is I was raised as an academic. My first career was in academics, and so to me, it's like you're always looking for the most seminal information to base everything else on, because then you're on a solid ground theoretically. But I think the Enneagram didn't develop as an academic discipline. There are just different people who got popular by teaching and writing books. And again, I have a lot of respect for all of them. But to me, from an academic point of view, why wouldn't you not like read up on the new ideas in the field to see maybe you can improve on what you're doing?
Yeah.
But I think we get invested in what we're doing, and it's hard to switch course.
And invested is the right word. And I think, Chris, if you remember when I recommended Bee's book at the training, the reason that I recommend it is because of all of the citing she does with all of the teachers, that there's so much research, there's, you know, and so you do feel like it's been well thought out, well researched, because, you know, there are people that need to be highlighted in this work. That is, I mean, we have giants that were, you know, standing on the shoulders. And I said that to Bea last night on the phone, that, you know, even with the passing of Claudio, you know, there are matriarchs and patriarchs that are another, even though you've been master teachers for many years, these will now be those that we can look to and continue to grow from, as we have from those greats that have left us, like David Daniels and Russ Hudson and now Claudio. So so Beatrice, thank you. We are so grateful. The subtype booklet, Kathleen, you're asking about, is on the website, Bea's website, which is right in the chat bar there. You can order it there. That's a wonderful chair side piece for spiritual directors and coaches and psychotherapists for a quick glance, to give people a way to see, and then take home the tome and, you know, get to know it, and take a look at the website I've given you for the Academy that Beatrice just began with her friend. And the work, the inner work that they do, is really all around subtypes and these instincts. And so if you're interested in continuing your Enneagram education in a formal way, those are really important places you can go. Also, I want to recommend Bea's online course, which is more of a beginner course with the Enneagram, but definitely will give you some solid handles around the subtypes. I was in your seminar at Loyola, and you said it was that work that's connected with this online course, and I found that to be really helpful in learning. And so can we all just take a moment and breathe for a minute in these closing moments, and just listen for the word or the phrase that seemed to be highlighted for you today. What seemed to capture you or warm your heart, or maybe disturb you a bit? Something that piqued your curiosity, and take a moment with it and open to what might be the invitation for you to continue the work. It might be an invitation for you to take another step in your own personal journey. Maybe you can just breathe in the word welcome, and let go on the exhale of anything that would keep you constricted and unwelcoming. And with that, we bless your work, Beatrice. We thank you for your work, and we look forward to what is ours to discover together in the future, and pray that you would be well, and that our world would be well because of the work that you're doing with the people that you're touching. And for all of our friends, all of our midday friends, take a look at the sidebar and all kinds of resources there. And again, always encouraging you to take a look at becoming a member of the IEA, and then mark the Great Lakes region as your tribe, and that can help us continue things like this, because that there will be a little bit of the portion of your membership fee that will help us with YouTube, with Constant Contact, with the new MailChimp, and And so with all of that, Teresa, do you have anything we need to know before we leave?
I think we're good. Thank you so much, Beatrice. What a joy. What a blessing.
Thank you. Thanks for all of you for inviting me to do this and for your time and attention.
It was awesome. And you too can go to YouTube and replay this and keep it. Bye-bye.
Bye.